In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a confrontation erupts outside a coffee shop. Sarah Winters, a passionate advocate for social change, calls the police on James Holden, a retired Marine, for wearing an offensive flag pin she claims promotes hate. Tensions rise as bystanders take sides, but when the truth about James's past and Sarah's hidden pain come to light, what unfolds shocks everyone and delivers powerful lessons about respect, understanding, and the dangers of snap judgments. The morning sun cast its golden glow over the Corner Café, a place where locals gathered to start their day. The serene atmosphere, with the hum of chatter and clinking cups, was about to shift. Sarah Winters, a 32-year-old activist passionate about equality, stepped out of her car. Her eyes scanned the outdoor seating until they stopped on James Holden, a man in his 60s sitting at a small table. His weathered face hinted at a life of experience, but it was the pin on his jacket that captured Sarah's attention. A small American flag adorned with an additional emblem sparked something in her. To Sarah, it wasn't just a patriotic accessory, it was a symbol of division. Her pulse quickened as she interpreted it as offensive, a statement she believed couldn't go unchallenged. With resolve, she approached him. "Excuse me," Sarah said sharply, standing before his table. "Do you realize that the pin you're wearing is offensive?" James looked up, his calm blue eyes meeting hers. He didn't seem startled, only curious. "Offensive?" he repeated. "What do you mean by that?" "That symbol," Sarah said, pointing at the pin, her voice unwavering. "It promotes hate and division. People like you shouldn't wear something like that in public." James tilted his head, studying her reaction. Then, with deliberate care, he unpinned the flag from his jacket and held it out. "This pin," he began, "isn't what you think. It's a tribute." "A tribute?" Sarah crossed her arms. "To what? Bigotry and intolerance?" James sighed, replacing the pin. "To my friends. To the men and women I served with. Many didn't make it back." His words carried a weight that hung in the air, but Sarah wasn't moved. "That doesn't change what it represents now," she argued. "Symbols like that have been co-opted by hate groups. Your intentions don't matter if it's hurting people." By now, their conversation had drawn attention. A young couple nearby exchanged whispers while a man in a business suit paused mid-step. Sarah, noticing the growing audience, felt emboldened. She pulled out her phone. "If you won't take it off," she declared, "I'll call the police." James raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" "Absolutely," she replied, already dialing. As she waited for the dispatcher to answer, the air grew thick with tension. Bystanders glanced at one another, some pulling out their own phones to record. The tranquil morning had turned into a spectacle. "Yes, I'm at the Corner Café on Maple Street," Sarah said into her phone. "There's a man here wearing a pin I believe promotes hate speech. It's making people uncomfortable." James remained seated, calm and composed, as Sarah ended the call and crossed her arms defiantly. "They'll be here soon," she said. "I'm not going anywhere," James replied evenly. Minutes passed like hours as the crowd grew larger. A teenager in a hoodie whispered to a friend, "This is going to blow up online." An older woman shook her head, muttering, "What is this world coming to?" When the police car finally pulled up, Officer Rachel Dawson stepped out. She adjusted her belt, taking in the scene. Her presence commanded attention as she approached Sarah and James. "Good morning," Dawson greeted, her tone steady. "What seems to be the issue?" Sarah gestured at James. "He's wearing a pin that promotes hate speech. It's offensive and shouldn't be allowed." Dawson turned to James. "Sir, may I see the pin?" "Of course," James replied, unpinning it once more and handing it over. The officer examined it carefully, her brow furrowing slightly. After a moment, she handed it back. "This pin doesn't appear to contain any hate speech, ma'am," she said to Sarah. "It seems like a personalized design." "But the message it sends," Sarah began, her voice rising. "Ma'am," Dawson interrupted gently but firmly, Symbols can mean different things to different people. What matters is intent, and I see no indication that this gentleman intended to offend anyone." Her words sent a ripple through the crowd. Some nodded, others continued recording. Sarah's face flushed with frustration, but before she could argue further, James spoke. "Officer, may I explain what this pin means to me?" Dawson nodded, and James stood, holding the pin for all to see. "This pin represents the 23rd Marine Battalion, the unit I served with during my military career. We designed it to honor our mission, unity and peace. It reminds me of the friends I lost and the ideals we fought for." The crowd fell silent. Even Sarah seemed momentarily taken aback. James continued, his voice steady. "I understand your concerns. Symbols can be misused, but they can also carry deep personal meaning. I'd ask you to consider that not everything is as it seems." His words lingered in the air, heavy with sincerity. For the first time, Sarah hesitated, her confidence faltering. The tension began to dissipate as the crowd slowly dispersed. Sarah stood in place, grappling with the complexity of what had just unfolded. The air hung heavy with tension as Officer Rachel Dawson stepped away from James and Sarah. The crowd, though thinning, still lingered, their eyes darting between the two. James remained seated, calm yet reflective. Sarah stood stiffly, her arms crossed and her phone gripped tightly as if it were her armor. "Ma'am," Officer Dawson said to Sarah, her voice steady but firm, "I understand this situation has stirred some strong emotions, but as I've said, this pin isn't what you believe it to be." Sarah's face flushed, frustration clear. "I don't understand how you can say that," she replied. "Symbols like that have been used to hurt people. They mean something, whether he admits it or not." James sighed, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. "You don't have to believe me," he said, "but I know what this pin means to me, and to the people it represents." The crowd murmured softly, their interest waning as Officer Dawson addressed them. "Ladies and gentlemen, this matter is resolved. There's no crime here. I encourage everyone to move on with their day." Slowly, reluctantly, the bystanders began to disperse. A few lingered, their phones still recording, while others exchanged quiet words as they walked away. The charged energy that had consumed the morning began to dissolve. As the officer returned to her car, Sarah and James were left alone at the cafe's outdoor seating. The quiet felt deafening compared to the earlier chaos. Sarah hesitated, her emotions visibly at war within her. Finally, she took a step toward James's table. "May I?" she asked, motioning to the chair across from him. James gestured for her to sit. "Of course." Sarah settled into the chair, her movements stiff and deliberate. For a moment they sat in silence, the faint hum of the cafe filling the space between them. "You seem very sure of yourself," Sarah said, breaking the quiet. Her voice was softer now, though it still carried an edge. "Like you've got all the answers." James shook his head. "Not at all," he said, "but I've lived long enough to know that answers aren't always as simple as we want them to be." Sarah frowned, her fingers drumming against the table. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means we all see the world through our own lens," James replied. "That lens is shaped by where we've been, what we've experienced, and yes, even what we fear. You're looking at this pin through your lens. I'm looking at it through mine." She studied him, her brow furrowing. "And your lens tells you this symbol isn't offensive? That it doesn't hurt people?" James leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "My lens tells me this pin represents unity, sacrifice, and the friends I lost. But I understand why someone else might see it differently. That's why I didn't get angry at you." Sarah blinked, surprised. "You didn't get angry?" "No," James said simply. "Anger doesn't solve much. It just builds walls." Her expression softened slightly, though skepticism still lingered in her eyes. So, what are you saying? That we should all just agree to disagree? James chuckled softly. Not exactly. I'm saying we should try to understand each other. That's the only way to move forward. Sarah looked down at her hands, her fingers tapping against the table. She seemed to be grappling with his words, trying to reconcile them with the convictions that had driven her actions. After a long pause, she spoke again. You said this pin represents your friends, the ones you lost. James nodded. That's right. Tell me about them, she said, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. James's expression softened, a flicker of pain crossing his face. They were the best people I've ever known, he said. Brave, kind, selfless. We went through hell together, and not all of us made it back. This pin is my way of keeping their memory alive. Sarah listened, her posture less rigid. There was something in his tone, raw, genuine, that made her pause. They sound like good people, she said softly. They were, James replied, and I'd like to think they fought for a world where people like you and me could have conversations like this. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she considered his words. The tension between them had eased, but the weight of their earlier confrontation still lingered. Maybe, she said finally, but I still think symbols like that can hurt people, even if you don't mean them to. James nodded thoughtfully. And maybe you're right. But that's why conversations like this matter. If we don't talk, we'll never understand each other. For the first time since their encounter began, Sarah smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was a beginning. As the morning crowd moved on and the cafe settled back into its rhythm, Sarah and James continued their quiet conversation. Words exchanged in softer tones, less heated than before, carried the weight of understanding rather than conflict. It was far from a resolution, but for the first time, they began to see beyond their differences. The hum of the coffee shop buzzed quietly in the background, a reminder of the world continuing around them. Sarah and James sat across from each other, their earlier tension replaced by a tentative calm. The conversation had shifted, but the emotional weight of their initial confrontation still lingered. Sarah cleared her throat. So, you said this pin is for your friends, she began. The ones you served with? James nodded. Yes, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. We were a tight-knit group, the 23rd Marine Battalion. Most of us were just kids when we signed up, really. We didn't know what we were getting ourselves into. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued despite herself. What was it like, she asked, serving in the military? James's gaze grew distant, his mind clearly pulling up memories. It was complicated, he admitted. There were moments of pride, moments of fear, and moments of loss. But through it all, there was camaraderie, a bond that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. Sarah studied his expression, noticing the subtle shifts in his features as he spoke. For the first time, she found herself seeing him not as an adversary, but as a human being with stories and scars of his own. And this pin, she said, pointing to it on his jacket. It represents that bond? James nodded again. It does. It's not just a flag to me. The design on it was created by our battalion. It's a tribute to our shared experiences, to those who didn't make it back. It's a way of keeping their memory alive. Her brow furrowed as she processed his words. I guess I've never thought of symbols like that before, she admitted. For me, it's always been about what they represent in the broader context, how they can be misused to hurt people. James tilted his head, considering her perspective. That's fair, he said. Symbols can take on different meanings depending on who's looking at them. And I won't deny that some people might misuse a symbol like this. But for me, it's personal. It's not about hate or division. It's about remembrance. The sincerity in his tone gave Sarah pause. She looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with her phone. "I guess I've been so focused on fighting injustice that I've forgotten to look at the people behind the things I'm fighting against," she admitted. James offered a small, understanding smile. "It's easy to do," he said. "When you're passionate about something, it's easy to see the world in black and white, but most of life happens in the gray areas." She nodded slowly, her mind turning over his words. "It must have been hard," she said after a moment, "losing your friends." James's smile faded, replaced by a somber expression. "It was," he said quietly. "Some days it still is. That's why I wear this pin, to remind myself of them, of what we stood for. It's not always easy, but it helps." Sarah looked up at him, her earlier hostility now replaced by a newfound respect. "I'm sorry for what you've been through," she said. "I didn't mean to belittle that." He shook his head. "You didn't," he said. "You were standing up for what you believe in, and I respect that. It's important to fight for what you think is right, but it's just as important to listen." The two of them fell into a comfortable silence, the tension between them all but gone. For a moment, they were simply two people sharing a conversation, their differences set aside. After a few minutes, Sarah broke the silence. "You know," she said, "I've spent so much time being angry at people who don't see things the way I do. I never stop to think about why they see the world differently." James nodded. "It's a hard thing to do," he said, "but it's worth it. Understanding doesn't mean you have to agree with someone. It just means you're willing to see things from their perspective." She smiled faintly, her gaze softening. "I think I've learned more in this conversation than I have in a long time," she admitted. James chuckled softly. "Me too," he said. "It's not every day someone challenges me like you did." Sarah laughed, the sound light and genuine. "I guess we both needed this," she said. As the conversation continued, the world around them seemed to fade away. The cafe, the onlookers, the earlier confrontation, it all felt distant now. In that moment it was just Sarah and James, two people from different worlds finding common ground. When Sarah finally stood to leave, she extended her hand to James. "Thank you," she said, "for your service and for this conversation." James took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Thank you," he replied, "for listening." As Sarah walked away, she glanced back over her shoulder, her mind swirling with thoughts. She had come to the cafe that morning ready to fight, but she was leaving with something far more valuable, a new perspective. And as James watched her go, he felt a quiet sense of hope. The world wasn't perfect, but moments like this reminded him that understanding was possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The following days brought a shift in Sarah's perspective. After her confrontation with James at the Corner Café, his calm words lingered, challenging beliefs she had held so firmly. As an activist, Sarah was used to standing strong, but now she questioned if she had been too quick to judge. Evenings became a time for reflection. She scrolled through articles and videos, diving into stories of veterans and the significance of symbols in their lives. Her search history, once filled with petitions and campaigns, now included military bonds and veterans' memories. Each story added depth to her understanding. And guilt. One evening, her phone buzzed with a notification, a video someone had uploaded from the cafe. She hesitated before clicking on it, watching as her sharp voice played out, followed by James's steady tone. The comments were divided, some siding with her, others with James. But one stood out. This was hard to watch, but it shows how important listening is. The words struck a nerve. For all her passion, Sarah realized she had spoken loudly but listened poorly. She knew she had to make amends, not just to James, but to herself. The next morning, Sarah returned to the Corner Café. She wasn't sure if James would be there, but she hoped he would. To her relief, he sat at the same table, a book in hand and his coffee steaming beside him. Taking a deep breath, she approached. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice lacking its earlier sharpness. James looked up, his expression warm. "Good morning," he replied with a small smile. "I wasn't sure if I'd see you again." Sarah sat without hesitation. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, "but I couldn't stop thinking about what we talked about." James closed his book, setting it aside. "I'm glad you came back," he said. "Conversations like the one we had aren't easy, but they're important." She nodded. "I've spent so much time fighting for what I believe in that I forgot to see things from someone else's perspective." James's smile grew. "That's not an easy thing to admit. It's a big step." Their conversation began with ease. Sarah asked James about his military experiences, and he spoke about the 23rd Marine Battalion, the camaraderie, and the weight of losing friends who felt like family. In turn, he asked about her activism, her motivations, and the challenges she faced. Their dialogue, rooted in mutual respect, built a bridge over differences that once seemed vast. Eventually, Sarah opened up about her father, a man whose rigid beliefs often clashed with hers. "I guess I've always seen people like you through his lens," she admitted. "I thought you were all the same." James nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like he left a big mark on you, even if it wasn't always positive." She looked down at her hands. "He did, but I think I've been holding on to that anger for too long. It's clouded the way I see people." "Anger can motivate," James said gently, "but it can also weigh you down. Maybe it's time to let some of it go." His words struck a chord. Sarah realized she had channeled her anger into activism, believing it gave her strength. But now she wondered if it had also built walls she hadn't intended. Hours passed unnoticed as their conversation deepened. The cafe shifted from the bustle of the morning rush to the calm of a quieter midday lull. At one point, James shared more about his late friend who inspired the pin. "His name was Andrew," he said, his voice heavy. "He was like a brother to me. When we designed this pin, it was his idea to add the emblem. It stood for unity, a reminder that we were stronger together." Sarah listened intently. "It's clear how much he meant to you," she said gently. "I can see why this pin is so important." James nodded. "It's not just a symbol. It's a connection to the past, to the people who shaped me. Losing them was hard, but forgetting them would be even harder." Sarah found herself deeply moved. The man sitting across from her wasn't just a figure of tradition. He was someone who had lived through profound loss and carried the memories of those he had loved with quiet dignity. "I didn't mean to take up so much of your time," Sarah said, glancing at her watch. James shook his head with a small smile. "You didn't. Conversations like this are worth the time." As Sarah stood to leave, she hesitated, then extended her hand. "James," she said, her voice steady but warm, "thank you for your patience and for sharing your story." James rose as well, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm but kind. "Thank you," he replied, "for being willing to listen." As Sarah walked away, she felt lighter, as though a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. Her encounter with James had begun as a confrontation, but had transformed into something she hadn't expected, an opportunity for growth. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time she felt open to understanding rather than judgment. And as James watched her leave, he felt a quiet hope. Change, he thought, doesn't come in sweeping gestures, but in small moments like these, moments where walls begin to crumble, replaced by bridges. In the weeks that followed, Sarah reflected deeply on the lessons she had learned from James. Their conversation at the Corner Café had sparked a transformation. For the first time, Sarah began to approach the world not as a battlefield but as a space for dialogue. Her activism took on a new tone. Instead of fiery debates, she sought meaningful conversations, asking questions rather than jumping to conclusions. The results were surprising. Where confrontation had often closed doors, curiosity opened them. She began to connect with people she never thought she'd understand. One day, as she walked through a local park, Sarah noticed a crowd gathered around a speaker. As she drew closer, she realized it was James. He stood near a veterans memorial, holding his pin aloft, his voice steady and sincere. "This pin," James said, "is a reminder of those I served with. It symbolizes unity and sacrifice, not just for the men and women I knew, but for all of us striving for a better world." Sarah joined the edge of the crowd, listening intently. His words carried the same authenticity that had moved her weeks ago. When the speech ended, she waited as others approached to thank him. Finally, their eyes met. "Sarah," James said, smiling warmly, "good to see you again." "You too," she replied. "Your speech was beautiful." "Thank you," he said. "It's always an honor to share their stories." As they walked together, James asked about her recent work. Sarah described how she had started attending events to listen and learn, and how those experiences had reshaped her activism. "It's been humbling," she admitted, "but it's also been rewarding. I feel like I'm finally making a real impact." James nodded. "It sounds like you've found your stride. Activism isn't just about fighting, it's about connecting, too." Their conversation sparked an idea in Sarah. "James," she said, her voice growing excited, "what if we worked together? We could organize events that bring people from different backgrounds together to share their stories. You could talk about your experiences as a veteran, and I could share what I've learned as an activist. Maybe we could inspire others to build bridges instead of walls." James smiled. "I like the sound of that," he said. "Let's do it." Over the following weeks, Sarah and James poured their energy into organizing their vision. They hosted community dialogues in libraries, schools, and local centers. At each event, James spoke about unity and sacrifice, while Sarah emphasized empathy and understanding. Their partnership created an atmosphere where people felt heard and valued. The impact was immediate. Attendees shared their own stories, finding common ground in unexpected places. One man, a former police officer, spoke about his challenges serving a divided community, while a young activist shared her struggles advocating for change. Both left the event with a newfound respect for each other. After one such event, Sarah and James sat quietly in the empty auditorium, reflecting on the evening. "This feels different," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet awe. "It's not just about advocating or debating. It's about creating something lasting." James nodded. "That's because it's not about us. It's about them, the people who come, the connections they make. That's what matters." The events began to gain traction. Local news outlets took notice, publishing articles about the unlikely partnership between a veteran and an activist. Their story resonated with many, sparking conversations in other communities. Schools reached out, asking them to speak to students about the importance of dialogue and understanding. At one event held in a large community center, a woman in her 70s approached Sarah after the discussion. Tears filled her eyes as she spoke. "I've spent so many years angry at people who didn't share my views," she said. "But listening to you both, I realize I've been missing so much. Thank you for helping me see things differently." Moments like these affirmed what Sarah and James had set out to achieve. They weren't solving all the world's problems, but they were making a difference, one conversation at a time. As Sarah sat beside James after another successful event, she reflected on how far they had come. "I never thought I'd be here," she said. "If you told me months ago that I'd be working with someone like you, I wouldn't have believed it." James chuckled. "Life has a way of surprising us," he said. "But sometimes those surprises are exactly what we need." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. She realized that the journey she had started with conflict had led her to something far greater, a movement built on understanding, compassion, and the simple yet profound act of listening. Together, they were building something that went beyond themselves, leaving behind a legacy others could carry forward. Months turned into a year, and the work that Sarah and James started together grew beyond anything they had anticipated. What had begun as a local effort to bridge gaps in understanding had now become a movement that inspired communities far and wide. Their events became a model for constructive conversations, with schools, workplaces, and even city councils replicating their approach. Opportunities arose that neither of them could have predicted. They were invited to speak at conferences, sit on panels, and even appear on televised discussions about bridging divides in a polarized world. Yet, through the accolades and recognition, Sarah and James remained grounded. For them, the true reward came from the stories shared by those whose lives had been changed. One such story came from a young man named Eric. At an event in a neighboring city, he stood up to share his experience. "I came here tonight full of anger," he admitted. "Anger at people who I thought didn't care about the things that mattered to me. But after hearing your stories and listening to others, I realized I've been holding on to anger because it's easier than understanding. Thank you for helping me see there's another way." Moments like these reaffirmed Sarah and James's belief in the power of dialogue. They knew they couldn't fix every problem or change every mind, but they could create spaces where understanding could take root. And that, they agreed, was enough. One evening, after wrapping up an event in a bustling city center, Sarah and James walked through the quiet streets together. The city lights cast a warm glow on the sidewalk, and the air was filled with the hum of distant traffic. "Do you ever think about how this all started?" Sarah asked, her voice thoughtful. James chuckled softly. "All the time," he said. "It's funny, isn't it, that something as small as a disagreement over a pin led to all this?" Sarah smiled. "It's humbling. I think about how quick I was to judge you that day, and how much I would have missed if I hadn't stopped to listen." James nodded. "We both learned something important that day. It's not just about standing up for what you believe. It's about being willing to hear someone else's perspective, even when it's uncomfortable." They walked in silence for a while before Sarah spoke again. "Do you ever wonder where this will go? What it will become?" James paused. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "but honestly, I'm just grateful for what it is now. We've already done more than I imagined." Sarah nodded, her heart full of gratitude. "Me too," she said softly. "I feel like I've found a purpose I didn't know I was looking for." As they reached the park where they had first worked together, they stopped and looked at the community center. Inside, a group of people was still gathered, deep in conversation. "Do you think they'll carry this forward?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the group. "I hope so," James said. "But even if they don't, we've planted seeds. That's all we can do." Sarah turned to James, a smile spreading across her face. "You know, I think I finally understand what you meant that day at the cafe, about symbols and the stories behind them. This movement we've built, it's like a symbol, too. It represents everything we've been through and everything we stand for." James smiled. "And like any good symbol, it's not about us. It's about the people who see it and make it their own." Their movement continued to grow, sparking collaborations with organizations dedicated to social change. They held workshops on effective communication, trained leaders to facilitate dialogue, and even developed a curriculum for schools to teach students about empathy and listening. The ripples of their work reached far beyond what either of them had dreamed. At one event held in a large community center, a woman in her 70s approached Sarah after the discussion. Tears filled her eyes as she spoke. "I've spent so many years angry at people who didn't share my views," she said. "But listening to you both, I realize I've been missing so much. Thank you for helping me see things differently." Moments like these affirmed what Sarah and James had set out to achieve. They weren't solving all the world's problems, but they were making a difference, one conversation at a time. As Sarah sat beside James after another successful event, she reflected on how far they had come. "I never thought I'd be here," she said. "If you'd told me months ago that I'd be working with someone like you, I wouldn't have believed it." James chuckled. "Life has a way of surprising us," he said. "But sometimes, those surprises are exactly what we need." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. She realized that the journey she had started with conflict had led her to something far greater, a movement built on understanding, compassion, and the simple yet profound act of listening. Together, they were building something that went beyond themselves, leaving behind a legacy others could carry forward. The world was far from perfect, but in moments like this it felt just a little bit brighter.